You know, Sophia is the only one who actually gets this family Claire. She's the one who shows up, who contributes, who doesn't make everything about her little feelings. We've all talked about it. It's time you stopped trying to be the center of everything. This weekend, just stay quiet and let the people who actually matter handle things. If you can't do that, maybe it's better if you don't come to these gatherings anymore. Hi, my name is Claire Donovan. I am 31 years old. The words were still hanging in the cold air inside the car when Ethan killed the engine. We had just pulled up the long gravel drive to the rented mountain cabin in western North Carolina. Snow from last night's light dusting still clung to the pine branches, and the cabin sat quiet under a pale winter sky. I kept my hands folded in my lap so he wouldn't see them shaking. 5 sentences. That was all it took for him to redraw the lines of our marriage in front of me, like it was nothing more than a seating chart he got to rearrange. I stepped out into the sharp mountain air and pulled my coat tighter. The cabin was bigger than I remembered from the photos. 2 stories of dark wood and stone-wide porch smoke already curling from the chimney. Vivian and Richard had arrived earlier with my sister Brooke and her husband Justin. Sophia's car was parked next to theirs. Of course it was. Ethan grabbed our bags without looking at me and headed for the door. I stayed back for a second, staring at the tire tracks in the thin snow, trying to remember the last time he had spoken to me without that particular edge in his voice. Inside, the warmth hit first, then the voices. Vivian was in the kitchen unpacking groceries. Richard was stacking firewood by the big stone fireplace. Brooke waved from the couch where she was scrolling on her phone. Sophia stood at the island pouring wine, laughing at something Ethan had just said. She turned when I walked in and gave me that bright, easy smile she had perfected years ago. "Claire, you made it," she said, like I was the one who might have backed out. "We were starting to worry the drive would be too much for you." I smiled back because that was what I always did. Traffic was fine. Ethan didn't correct her. He just set our bags down and accepted the glass Sophia handed him. I watched the two of them for a second longer than I should have. There was a familiarity there that used to make me feel safe. Now it felt like a door that had quietly closed while I was still standing on the other side. The first evening passed the way these gatherings always did. Dinner stories about work plans for the next day's hike if the weather held. Ethan was charming with everyone else. He asked Brooke about her new job, complimented Vivian on the meal, even listened to Richard's long story about his latest fishing trip. With me, he was polite in the way you are polite to someone you share a carpool with. Short answers, no eye contact when it wasn't required. I kept waiting for the moment he would soften the way he used to. When we were alone, it never came. Later that night, after everyone had gone to their rooms, I stayed up to finish unpacking. Our bedroom was on the second floor at the end of the hall. Ethan had already claimed the side of the bed near the window and was scrolling on his phone with the light off. I opened the small closet to hang up my sweaters and noticed a cardboard box on the top shelf that hadn't been there when we arrived. It looked like something Vivian had brought up from storage, old photo albums, maybe, or extra linens. I pulled it down quietly so I wouldn't wake him. Inside were a few old notebooks and a stack of loose papers. One of the notebooks had a faded green cover I didn't recognize. I opened it without thinking, just curious. The handwriting on the first page stopped me cold. It was Ethan's. The date at the top was from 3 years ago. The entry below it was short. Sophia gets it. She always has. Claire still thinks this is about her feelings. It's not. It's about keeping things balanced. We agreed she stays in the background. We handle the rest. She'll be fine. She always is. I read it twice, then a third time. My hands felt numb against the paper. I flipped forward a few pages. More entries, different dates, the same calm, almost bored tone. Sophia said Claire's idea for the community project was too emotional. She's right. We're going with Sophia's version. Claire won't push back. She never does. Family gathering this weekend. Sophia and I will make sure everyone sees who actually carries the load. Claire can sit there and smile like she always does. It's easier that way. I closed the notebook. The cabin was completely silent except for the low hum of the heating system. Down the hall, I could hear someone's soft snoring. Ethan's breathing was steady behind me. I stood there in the dark, holding his old journal, like it was something fragile that might break if I moved too fast. The next morning, I woke up before anyone else. I made coffee in the quiet kitchen and carried a mug out onto the back porch. The mountains were still dark against the sky. I pulled my phone out and texted my colleague Marcus Hale, the only person outside this cabin I trusted with anything real. Claire, can you pull the security footage from the cabin next door if Harold Bennett sends it? Something happened last night. I need to see it. Marcus replied within minutes. He knew Harold Bennett, the older man who owned the cabin 2 properties over and ran the small security company that covered several of the rentals up here. Harold was the kind of neighbor who noticed everything and said very little. Marcus, he already sent it. Said Ethan and Sophia met on the side porch around 11 last night. Camera caught the whole conversation. You want me to forward it? I told him yes. Then I sat on the cold wooden steps and waited for the sun to come up. Over the ridge, the journal still heavy in my coat pocket. When the file came through, I watched it with the sound low. The camera angle was wide but clear enough. Ethan and Sophia stood close together near the railing, their voices carrying just enough for the microphone to pick up. Sophia's voice was calm, almost amused. She'll sit there and take it like she always does. You know she will. Ethan laughed under his breath. That's the whole point. If she ever actually pushed back, this would be harder. But she won't. She never has. They talked for another minute about how the weekend would go, who would bring up what, how they would frame certain stories, so the rest of the family would see me as the one who was too sensitive, the one who didn't contribute. Sophia said something about making sure Vivian and Richard understood that Ethan had been carrying everything for years. Ethan agreed. Then they went back inside. I closed the video. My breath came out in small white clouds. The sun was just starting to touch the tops of the trees. Inside the cabin, I could hear someone moving around in the kitchen, probably Vivian making breakfast. I stayed on the porch a little longer, the cold seeping through my coat, the journal and the video sitting side by side on my phone like 2 pieces of the same lock I had never known existed. Ethan came out a few minutes later, already dressed for the day. He looked at me for a second like he was trying to decide what version of me he was dealing with. You're up early, he said. I nodded. Couldn't sleep. He didn't ask why. He just poured himself coffee and went back inside. I watched the door close behind him and felt something small and final settle in my chest. Not anger yet, not even hurt. Just the clear, cold knowledge that the man I had married had been planning for years how to keep me small in every room we walked into together. I stayed on the porch until my fingers started to go numb. Then I went inside, helped Vivian with breakfast, smiled at the right moments, and waited for the rest of the day to unfold. I didn't say anything about the journal. I didn't mention the video. I just watched. And I started counting the hours until I could decide what staying quiet had actually cost me. The morning moved forward in small, ordinary pieces that felt anything but ordinary once I knew what I knew. Vivian made pancakes and asked everyone how they had slept. Richard talked about the trail conditions for a possible hike later. Brooke and her husband Justin sat at the big wooden table scrolling through photos from their last trip. Sophia helped Ethan carry plates to the sink, laughing at something he said under his breath. I sat at the end of the table and passed the syrup when someone asked for it. My hands were steady. My voice was even. Inside, every word from the journal kept looping. After breakfast, the group decided on a short walk down to the creek before the heavier snow moved in. The air was cold enough to bite through coats. Ethan walked ahead with Sophia and Richard. I stayed back with Vivian and Brooke. My mother-in-law asked me about work in that gentle way she had, the one that always made me feel seen for a minute. I told her about the new client project I'd taken on, the one that had kept me up late for weeks. She nodded and said it sounded like something I would be good at. Behind us, Ethan's voice carried just far enough. Sophia's the one who actually closed that big account last quarter, he said to Richard. Claire's still figuring out how to balance everything. You know how she gets overwhelmed. It was said lightly, like a fact everyone already accepted. Sophia didn't correct him. She just smiled and changed the subject to something Richard had asked about the stock market. I kept walking. The snow crunched under my boots. My chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with the altitude. We reached the creek and stood on the rocks for a while. Ethan took a few pictures on his phone and showed them to Sophia first. When Brooke asked to see, he handed the phone over without looking at me. I didn't ask. I had learned a long time ago that asking made the distance more obvious. Back at the cabin, people scattered. Some napped, some played cards by the fire. I stepped outside again to call Marcus. The reception was spotty, but clear enough. Harold sent more, Marcus said. His voice was careful. Not just last night. He's had the cameras running for the whole rental season because of some break-ins last year. There's footage from 2 months ago, Ethan and Sophia at that coffee shop near your house. They were talking about how to handle the holidays. Sophia said something about making sure you didn't take up too much space at the table. Ethan agreed. I closed my eyes for a second. The mountains around the cabin felt suddenly farther away. Did Harold say anything else? I asked. He said he almost deleted it because it wasn't his business. Then he saw the way Ethan talked to you when you arrived yesterday and decided you should know. He's a quiet guy, Claire, but he doesn't like watching people get boxed in. I thanked him and hung up. When I turned around, Harold Bennett was standing on the path between our cabin and his, holding a small thermos. He lifted it in a half wave. Figured you might need something warm after that walk, he said when I got closer. His voice was low and steady, the kind that didn't ask for anything back. Your husband and his friend have been meeting out here pretty regular when they think no one's watching. I don't record sound on the side cameras, but the pictures tell enough. He didn't push for details. He just handed me the thermos and nodded toward the trees. Some people only feel big when they make someone else feel small. Doesn't make it right. If you need anything, a ride into town, a quiet place to think, my door's open. No questions. I took the thermos. The heat seeped through my gloves. Thank you. He gave another small nod and walked back toward his cabin. I stood there holding the thermos and watched him go. For the first time since I'd found the journal, I felt something shift. Not hope exactly, just the knowledge that someone outside the circle had seen it too. Inside, the afternoon stretched. Ethan and Sophia sat on the couch going through old photo albums Vivian had brought. Every few minutes, one of them would laugh and show a picture to the room. When they got to one of our wedding, Ethan closed the album without passing it around. Some memories are better left in the past, he said, and Sophia nodded like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. I went upstairs to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. The journal was still in my coat pocket. I took it out and flipped to the last entry I had read. The date was from 6 months ago. Sophia thinks we should start being more direct. Claire keeps acting like everything is fine. If she won't see it on her own, maybe it's time the rest of the family helps her understand her place. Publicly. at the winter gathering. She'll either get the message or she won't. Either way, it stops being my problem. I closed the notebook again. My hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped somewhere between the creek and Harold's thermos. I put the journal back in my pocket and went downstairs. Dinner that night was loud in the way family dinners in cabins always are, overlapping conversations, clinking plates, the fire popping. Vivian had made a big pot of chili. Richard told stories. Brooke and Justin teased each other about who was worse at board games. Ethan sat at the head of the table. Sophia sat to his right. I sat 2 seats down on the left. Halfway through the meal, Ethan set his spoon down and looked around the table. I wanted to say something while we're all here, he started. His voice was warm, the version of it everyone else got to hear. This family has been through a lot, and I think it's important we're honest about who's really been holding things together. Sophia smiled into her glass. I felt my stomach drop the way it had in the car the night before. He was starting it right here in front of everyone. He didn't get to finish the sentence. Vivian's phone rang on the counter. She stood up to answer it, and the moment broke. Ethan picked up his spoon again like nothing had happened. Sophia gave me a small, almost sympathetic look across the table. I looked back at my bowl and counted the minutes until I could stand up without it seeming strange. Later, after the dishes were done and most people had gone to their rooms, I stepped out onto the back porch again. The snow had started falling harder. Ethan came out a few minutes later. He didn't sit down. He just leaned against the railing and looked at me. "You've been quiet tonight," he said. There was an edge under the words, the same one from the car. "Everything okay?" I met his eyes. For the first time in a long time, I didn't fill the silence with an easy answer. "I found your old journal," I said. My voice was calm, and I saw the security footage from Harold's cameras. You and Sophia. The plans, the pact, all of it. He didn't flinch. He didn't look surprised. He just studied me for a second like I was a problem he had already solved in his head. "Then you know it's better this way," he said finally. "You've never been good at the big picture, Claire. Sophia and we protect the family from the parts that don't work. You get to stay comfortable. That's what you've always wanted, isn't it?" The snow kept falling between us. Inside the cabin, someone turned off a light. The only sound was the wind moving through the pines. I didn't answer him. I just turned and walked back inside, leaving him standing on the porch with the snow collecting on his shoulders. The door clicked shut behind me. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to explain why I was walking away. Upstairs in the dark bedroom, I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and pulled out my phone. I opened a new message to Marcus. "Claire, I need a ride out of here tomorrow morning, early, before anyone else wakes up." He replied almost immediately. "Marcus Harold already offered. He said he'll be ready at 6. No questions." I set the phone down and stared at the ceiling. The cabin was quiet again. Somewhere down the hall, Ethan was probably already in bed, already planning how he would explain this to the rest of them in the morning. I didn't know what I was going to say when the sun came up. I only knew that the version of me who had stayed quiet for years had finally run out of reasons to keep doing it. And that knowledge sat in my chest like something I couldn't put back in a box, no matter how hard I tried. The alarm on my phone vibrated at 5:40 the next morning. I had barely slept. The cabin was still dark and cold. Ethan was turned away from me in the bed, his breathing deep and even. I moved quietly, pulling on the same clothes from the day before and stuffing the rest into my bag. The green journal stayed in my coat pocket. I didn't want it, but I couldn't leave it behind either. Downstairs, the living room was empty except for the dying embers in the fireplace. I slipped out the front door and walked the short path to Harold Bennett's cabin. His truck was already running the headlights, cutting through the falling snow. He didn't ask questions when I climbed in. He just handed me a travel mug of coffee and pulled onto the narrow mountain road. We drove in silence for the first 20 minutes. The only sound was the wipers and the crunch of tires on fresh snow. Then Harold spoke, his voice low. Some people spend their whole lives making sure someone else stays small so they can feel big. It's not your job to keep shrinking for them. I nodded. My throat felt tight. I stayed quiet for a long time. I thought that was what kept the peace. Harold glanced over. Quiet can feel like peace. When you're the one being asked to stay that way, doesn't mean it is. We reached the main road as the sky started to lighten. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Ethan's name lit up the screen. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. A minute later, a text came through. Ethan, where the hell are you? Vivian is asking questions. Don't make this a bigger deal than it is. I turned the phone off and put it in the glove box. Harold didn't comment. By the time we reached the small airport 2 hours later, the snow had stopped. Marcus had already booked me on the first flight back to Charlotte. Harold walked me to the security line and handed me a folded piece of paper with his number on it. If you ever need a place that doesn't come with conditions, he said you know where I am. I thanked him again, then I walked through security without looking back. The flight was short. I sat by the window and watched the mountains disappear beneath the clouds. My hands had stopped shaking somewhere on the drive. In their place was a heavy, clear sadness that I didn't try to push away. I let it sit there. It felt honest. When I landed, I took a rideshare straight to my apartment. The place felt smaller than I remembered, but also quieter in a way that didn't hurt. I dropped my bag by the door and sat on the couch for a long time without turning on any lights. The journal was still in my coat. I took it out and set it on the coffee table. I didn't open it again. Over the next few days, the messages came in waves. Ethan called, then Sophia, then Vivian. I answered none of them. On the fourth day, my sister Brooke texted, Brooke, Mom is worried. She said you left without saying goodbye. Ethan told everyone you've been struggling with work stress and needed space. Is that true? I stared at the message for a long time before I replied. Claire, it's not true. I found out Ethan and Sophia have been planning ways to keep me small for years. I have proof. I'm not coming back to the gatherings. She didn't answer right away. When she did, it was short. Brooke, I don't know what to say. I'm sorry I didn't push. I just put the phone down. A week later, Vivian showed up at my door. She looked smaller than she had at the cabin, her coat buttoned all the way up against the cold. I let her in. We sat at my small kitchen table with mugs of tea. Neither of us drank. I saw the journal, she said after a while. Her voice was steady but tired. Ethan left it on the counter the morning you left. I read enough. I waited. He and Sophia have been doing this for a long time, Vivian continued. Not just with you. They did something similar with your father-in-law's sister years ago. Richard and I didn't see it clearly then. We told ourselves it was just strong personalities. I'm sorry we didn't look harder. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine for a moment. I'm not going to ask you to come back to the big gatherings, she said. I understand why you can't, but I want you to know you're still welcome at my house. Just you. No conditions, no performances. The tears came then, not loud, just quiet and steady, the kind that had been waiting since I found the journal. Vivian didn't try to stop them. She just sat with me until they slowed. When she left, she hugged me at the door. Some cycles only continue because no one is willing to be the first one to step out of them, she said. You did that. It costs something. I see that it does. After she was gone, I stood in the quiet apartment and let the words settle. Staying quiet had kept the cycle alive. It had let Ethan and Sophia keep rewriting the story of who I was in every room we shared. Walking away didn't feel like victory. It felt like the only honest thing left to do. The weeks that followed were uneven. Some days I woke up clear and focused on my work. Other days, the silence in the apartment pressed in, and I had to go for long walks just to remember how to breathe normally. Marcus checked in every few days with no pressure. Harold sent one short text, "Cabin's still here if you need it." I didn't go back, not yet. Ethan tried one more time 3 weeks after I left. He showed up at my building one evening with a folder of what he called our shared finances. I met him in the lobby instead of inviting him up. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. The sarcasm was still there, but thinner now. Everyone's asking questions. "Sophia thinks you're being dramatic on purpose." I looked at him for a long moment. The man I had married was still in there somewhere, but the version standing in front of me had spent years practicing how to make me smaller so he could feel steady. "I'm not coming back," I said. My voice was calm. "Not to the cabin, not to the holidays, not to any of it. If you want to talk about divorce paperwork, we can do that through lawyers. Otherwise, there's nothing left to discuss." He opened his mouth like he was going to argue, then closed it. For the first time, I could remember he didn't have a ready answer that put me in my place. He just nodded once, turned, and walked out into the night. The final loss came quietly. The automatic invitations stopped. No more group texts about dates. No more "we're doing the cabin again this year, you" in messages. The silence where those messages used to be was its own kind of ache. I let myself feel it. Then I started filling the space with other things, new clients, long phone calls with Brooke when she reached out, quiet dinners with Marcus and his partner, weekends where I didn't have to perform for anyone. One evening in early spring, I drove out to Harold's cabin again, not to stay, just to thank him properly. He was sitting on his porch when I pulled up. We drank coffee and watched the last of the snow melt off the lower slopes. "You look lighter," he said after a while. "I feel heavier some days," I answered honestly. "But it's a different kind of heavy, the kind that doesn't come from pretending anymore." He nodded like that made perfect sense. On the drive back, I thought about the lesson that had been forming since the moment I found the journal. Staying quiet had kept the cycle alive. It had protected Ethan and Sophia from ever having to face what they were doing. It had taught everyone around us that my discomfort was something to be managed rather than something to be believed. Leaving didn't fix everything. It didn't give me back the years, but it stopped me from being the person who kept the door open for the next round of diminishment. I still have hard days. I still miss the version of family I thought I had, but I no longer wake up wondering what version of myself I'm supposed to perform that day. That alone feels like enough to build on. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever stayed quiet in a room where someone was steadily rewriting who you were allowed to be, what would it take for you to walk out? Drop enough in the comments if this one hit close to home.